There's a squat brick building on the edge of an industrial park outside Tulsa. You've driven past the exit for it maybe a dozen times over 2 months. This time you actually take it. Cold Line Mechanical Services, commercial refrigeration and HVAC, 6 service trucks, 1 union crew, contracts with 4 regional grocery chains, 38 people on the books, roughly $7.4 million a year moving through it. You sit in your car in the gravel lot and just look at the place for a while. One of the bay doors is open. A technician is loading spare compressors into a van. Nobody's in a hurry. The owner, a man named Gary Felt, has already told you on the phone that he wants $9.5 million for the whole operation. You have $31,000 sitting in checking. Not $31 million. $31,000. You actually pull up the account on your phone again in the parking lot, like maybe you misread it that morning. Most reasonable people turn the car around at this point. Instead, you take out a small notebook you bought specifically for this and you start writing things down. You couldn't tell someone exactly why you're doing this if they asked. You don't have a tidy explanation. You just keep going. Here's what almost nobody knows about Gary. He's 64. His son works in software in Denver and has said, more than once, that he'd rather sell insurance door to door than run a refrigeration company. His longtime service manager, the guy who actually keeps the union crew functioning, has been making noises about retiring next spring. 2 of Gary's 4 grocery contracts are up for renewal inside the next 7 months, and one of the chains got bought by a bigger regional player last year. Nobody knows yet if the new parent company plans to keep using outside contractors or bring the work in-house. Gary needs to sell, not eventually, soon. But he wants it to look like a man stepping away on his own schedule, not a man being pushed out a door. You can hear that distinction every time he talks. It matters to him more than the number does, almost. You know most of this before you ever call his office, because you spend 6 weeks doing something that looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. You read every public filing tied to the company you can find. You track down a supplier who sells Gary his refrigerant lines and buy him a beer at a trade show neither of you had any real reason to attend. He mentions, almost as an aside, that one of Gary's grocery clients has been slow paying invoices for a year, and Gary's been quietly covering the gap out of his own pocket to keep the crew's overtime funded. You write it down. That single sentence is worth more to you than anything in the public record. Information is the actual currency here, not the pitch, not the charm, not the confidence. Most people skip straight to the part that feels like doing something. The meeting, the offer, the handshake. You spend weeks just listening first. That's the order that actually works. You show up to the first real meeting 7 minutes early, dressed carefully but not sharply. You don't want to look like someone who needs this too badly. Gary comes out to the lobby himself, which catches you off guard a little. Firm handshake, the kind of eye contact that feels like it's evaluating something. He offers you coffee from a machine that's clearly older than his newest truck. You take it even though your stomach is already doing something unpleasant. He talks for a long stretch about starting the business in 1994 out of the back of a single van, about surviving 2008 when 2 competitors in the same metro folded inside 18 months of each other. He's proud of that in the specific way people are proud of things that actually cost them something. You don't interrupt. You don't steer toward numbers. You just let him talk. Eventually there's a pause, and you ask him exactly one question. What made you decide now's the time? Something in his posture changes. Small, but real. You think, and you could be wrong, that he's used to people who walk in with spreadsheets already open, already talking about synergies and growth multiples before they've asked him a single real question. You just don't do that. You genuinely don't know if it's strategy on your part or just nerves keeping you quiet. Either way, it works the same. He tells you, in a roundabout way, about a knee that needs replacing and a doctor who's used the word "before it gets worse" twice now. He mentions his son in Denver, not with resentment, just fact. He says he's tired of chasing certifications and insurance audits every single year for margins that keep getting thinner. Not the trucks, not the crew, the paperwork, and the grinding renewal cycle. That's the thing that's actually worn him down. Then, almost like it isn't the point of the whole conversation, he gives you the real number. Not the $9.5 million he quoted on the phone. The number underneath that, the one that would actually let him stop thinking about it. $6.8 million. He's already discounted it in his own head. He just needed somebody patient enough to sit there while he said it out loud. You thank him, Tell him you'll follow up in 2 weeks, and he nods like that's a completely ordinary thing for someone to say. You drive home and sit at your kitchen table with the lights off for close to an hour, not really thinking, just sitting with it. $6.8 million. You have $31,000. The distance between those two numbers is exactly the part that stops almost everyone who ever gets this close. It stops you too, for longer than you'd like to admit out loud. But the business itself can fund most of its own purchase if the structure is built correctly. That's not some trick. It's arithmetic. It only works, though, if you do every step in order and don't let panic skip you ahead. You've seen what happens when people panic here. It collapses in a very specific, very avoidable way. The first call you make is to an operations consultant you've known for years, a woman who's blunt in a way you've always appreciated. You lay out everything, the number, the contracts, the union crew, the slow-paying grocery chain. She's quiet for a second and then says something close to, "That's either a genuinely good idea or a genuinely bad one, and I can't tell yet which." You ask her to help you figure out which one it is. She agrees for 4% equity if this actually closes. Together, you spend the better part of a week building a real financial model, and what it shows, not the version you were hoping for, the actual version, is that the existing service contracts throw off enough predictable cash flow to service a substantial loan on their own, assuming the renewals hold, which means the second move is securing those renewals before you touch a bank. You go to the grocery chain that's been slow to pay, the one everyone assumes is a liability. Instead of chasing them for money, you ask, carefully, hypothetically, whether they'd consider locking in a 4-year service agreement at a modest discount in exchange for guaranteed response times and priority scheduling. Their facilities director, it turns out, has been dreading a bidding process and says yes almost before you finish the sentence. You get it in writing. Now you're holding something a bank will actually take seriously. A signed letter of intent from a real client, a financial model built on real numbers, and a motivated seller who's already told you his true number out loud. Before any of that, though, there's a Tuesday where the whole thing nearly falls apart. You get a call from the service manager, the one who's been talking about retiring, and he tells you flatly that he's not interested in staying on under new ownership. Full stop, regardless of who you are or what you offer. For about 2 days, you genuinely think the deal is dead, because a refrigeration company without someone who can actually run the crews on the ground isn't a company. It's just a fleet of trucks and a phone number. You spend those 2 days doing something you hadn't planned on, which is sitting down with the 2 senior technicians directly, off the record, and asking what they'd actually need to stay if leadership changed hands. Neither of them wants the manager title. Both of them, it turns out, would stay for a modest raise and a promise that scheduling decisions wouldn't get made by someone who's never been inside a walk-in freezer. You write that down too. It costs you almost nothing, and it quietly solves the one problem that could have killed the entire deal. Gary never even finds out how close it came to unraveling on your end, and you don't tell him. You walk into a regional bank where you have a modest, unremarkable relationship, and you lay all of it on the table. You're not asking them to fund the whole purchase. You're asking for a leveraged structure where the business itself, its contracts, and its cash flow secures roughly 2/3 of the loan. You're simply the person who's going to run it. 16 days later, a term sheet lands in your inbox. You read it 4 times, looking for the part where it doesn't say what you think it says. It never comes. The bank is willing to fund $4.5 million. You still need $2.3 million in equity to actually close this, and you have $31,000. This is where most people stop entirely. You understand exactly why. The gap still feels enormous. You've been carrying this quietly for almost 2 months. And there's a voice. There's always a voice, telling you that you're one phone call away from embarrassing yourself in front of people whose opinion you actually care about. You make the calls anyway. The first goes to a retired plant manager in his late 60s who's mentioned more than once, almost bitterly, that his savings are sitting in a money market account doing essentially nothing. You show him the model, the term sheet, the signed letter of intent. You offer him 11% equity. He asks slow, careful, specific questions, the kind that take real time to answer honestly. Eventually, he says he's in. The second call goes to a private investor out of Oklahoma City you've only met through a mutual contact, someone you've spoken to maybe twice before this. He looks at the same package and says something close to, "The bank's already done the hard part of the diligence for me. which is exactly correct and exactly why it works. You're not selling either of them a story or a vision. You're showing them a profitable, operating business, a signed contract, and a term sheet from an institution that's already run the numbers independently. There's real risk in it. You don't pretend otherwise, but it's a calculated risk sitting on top of verified cash flow, not a leap of faith. Together, the two of them commit $2.3 million. You now control a majority stake in a $9.5 million company, having put in $31,000 of your own money. It's a structure built entirely on leverage and sequencing. The partners come in after the deal is already standing, not before. In theory, anyway. It's still just theory until Gary signs. You go back to him exactly 14 days after your first meeting, precisely when you told him you would. You couldn't fully explain why keeping that specific promise matters so much to you, except that everything else about this has felt uncertain, and that one small thing is completely within your control. You offer him $6.5 million, slightly under the number he gave you, and you both know it. The structure matters more than the headline figure. $4.2 million at closing, the remaining $2.3 million paid out over 16 months, backed by a personal guarantee and a lien against the main service facility. It gives him a clean exit and an actual timeline instead of an open-ended process. He sits with it for what feels like a long time. Then he just says, "All right, let's do it," not with excitement. Just like something heavy is finally being set down carefully rather than dropped. He signs. And that's it. You own Cold Line Mechanical Services. You walk out to your car afterward and you don't have a single organized thought in your head. Your hands are slightly unsteady, buckling your seatbelt. You sit in the lot for a few minutes before you actually start the engine. Later, when people hear the story secondhand, they tend to fill in the blanks with whatever's easiest to believe. You got lucky. You knew somebody. You had money nobody else knew about. It's more comfortable to imagine you had access to something rare than to imagine you just did the unglamorous work nobody wants to do. What they don't see is 6 weeks of quiet research before a single real conversation happened. An hour sitting alone in a dark kitchen doing math that still didn't fully add up. A consultant telling you honestly that this might be a mistake. A facilities director who almost said no. 16 days of waiting on a bank with nothing to do but not think about it, which is much harder than it sounds. They don't see the retired plant manager asking careful, patient questions across his kitchen table while you tried to look more certain than you felt. They don't see Gary going quiet before he finally says yes. They don't see the 2 technicians you sat down with off the record, or the quiet raise you promised them out of your own pocket before you'd even signed anything, just to make sure the crews would still be there on the first Monday you actually owned the place. None of that shows up in the version of the story that gets repeated at dinner parties because it isn't dramatic and it doesn't flatter anyone. It's just the actual mechanism underneath the whole thing. You don't buy a company you can't afford. You build slowly and imperfectly the exact conditions that make it possible. Through gravel parking lots and dark kitchens and long stretches of waiting for someone else to make a decision. Only then do you actually buy it. That part never makes it into how people tell the story afterward. It's the only part of it that's actually true.